I'll start briefly with this housing history that's specific to Field School. And if you want more information, this is really a synopsis because there's the article from 2005 that I wrote is on the website at the Hennepin History Museum. So I'm going to be talking about housing and school desegregation. I'd like to just, I won't be reading many slides, but I would like to say this. Price of privilege is the moral duty to act. All right, what are the key concepts I want to discuss today? And they are open housing, school pairing, and disamenities. So we'll be talking first about open housing. So this is the article that I found first when I started doing my research, and there are two huge specific events that you can see here. On the right, it talks about the Brown versus Board of Education legal case that was settled in 1954, but on the left is the Tilson built homes that were going to be built and open on an open market basis for the first time, we think possibly in the country. So much of what was in this article is what informs my understanding of this history. So open housing was in part advanced by the Tilson built homes. They moved housing available for African Americans along the segregated housing line of 40th Street. There were two African American families that lived south of 40th Street in the early 50s, so it was not completely cut off, but this housing event of the Tilson built homes being built allowed more people en masse to buy homes further south than the segregated housing line of 40th Street. And this is what the Tilson built homes look like. They're built primarily between 33rd and 46th. So this map is really my reference point for the conversation I'm going to have. And so the Tilson built homes were built between just south of Lake Street down to 46th, which is where McCrae Park is, and that Lee family home that we heard about last. And then Shenandoah Terrace is where racial covenants were. And this is where I grew up on 11th Avenue and 48th. And then this is the Minnehaha Parkway. And you can see Field and Hale here. So 40th Street, like we talked about, was the line. 42nd Street is where Currents is, if you need a reference point. And as you can see up here, Nicollet and Chicago Avenues were the lines that African Americans could not cross over during the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So first of what I want to say is that in talking to elders in our community, an older African American vet who grew up on Snelling Avenue in the 30s told me that they did not have certain standard facilities that we consider, that I think most whites would consider were available for everyone. So on Snelling Avenue, there was no standard garbage removal. All the babies in his family, all his siblings had to be born at home. They couldn't be born at the hospitals. They could go afterwards if they needed care, but they couldn't be born there. And there were many restaurants and hotels and nightclubs they couldn't go to. He said that on Saturday morning, he and his dad would have to drive around with a gas can to get gas for the cars to see which station would sell to them. And then many rental units did not have what were called standard facilities like plumbing and heating. I don't know if any of you are familiar with The Warmth of Other Suns, but it's a really great educational tool of understanding how the Great Migration happened from the South to the North as African Americans were looking for better housing and working conditions. So in Minneapolis, the League of Women Voters noted that over a 20-year period from 1940 to 60, Blacks more than doubled in the population, but still there were only 6 pocket areas where people could buy homes. And you can see that the suburbs were closed as well. That's where we talked, Denise talked about FHA loans weren't available to African Americans or to vets. So there was only 11 Blacks in Bloomington, 24 in Brooklyn Center, 8 in Crystal. So this is in 1961. This is the year I was born. So there was restricted housing, as we can see. And then on that map that was in that same article, this is where the Tilson built homes were. You can see that in Minneapolis, people, African American community, and it was a racially mixed community. At least 50-50, but this is where the redlining was. And so it was in the South Central community, just north of Lake Street. This is the Phillips community here, North Minneapolis, 2 communities. And then there was along Hiawatha Corridor, Snelling Avenue. So there was a commission called the, I apologize, the Interfaith Housing Commission that in 1947 said there was really poor substandard housing conditions and public outcry by the Urban League, and they demanded improved housing and housing market conditions. So the Housing and Home Finance Agency, this Chicago branch, sent a representative from Chicago to meet with the Urban League in Minneapolis. So this is the Housing and Home Finance Agencies. They were called the Racial Relations Service, and they began during the Roosevelt administration in '38. They're the ones who sent a representative to Minneapolis to meet with the Urban League. And they met with Archie Givens, who worked with Minneapolis Housing Authority and was a realtor, and he recruited a developer, Edward Tilson. And Tilson had a reputation for rejecting bank conditions that housing be built only segregated. So they formed a partnership, and they built 63 houses. They purchased empty lots and built new homes. And as you can see here, they were FHA financed. And this was a first. They had advertisements in the local papers. You can see Archie Givens' name here. So this was in 1954. So this event was considered one of the most important housing programs. It expanded quote unquote Negro occupancy to the Central Parkway section of the city, and it led to temporary relief from the pressure on the housing market. It's not enough, but it's a first in the field of housing on an open occupancy basis. So this was in the Spokesman newspaper, and then the Minneapolis Urban League reported Tilson built. The NAACP also noted that this was one of the first in the country where people could buy new homes on an open market basis. So I'm hoping you understand the concept of open housing. It was you were able to buy houses then with FHA loans or mortgages on what they called an open market basis, new homes. So there were a number of people that were coming from the South and only able to live in the projects in North Minneapolis. And maybe they did have a good income, but they weren't able to buy a home in a nicer neighborhood. So this open housing event allowed people to buy a new home. Archie Givens Jr., the son of Archie, said this was the first time they were able to get a new home with a backyard and have their own house. So next we're going to talk about school pairing and the difference between school pairing and one-way busing. Why did we need school pairing? In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education said all schools must be desegregated. So the school that I went to was Hale, and I was bused to Field in 1971 when the schools desegregated. The lawsuit noted that because schools are segregated, this did not provide an equal education to all students in Minneapolis. Booker versus Special School District 1, which is the Minneapolis schools, and it was the plaintiffs were all school children residing in Minneapolis. So the South Side schools, here's our map again that I talked about, and this is where the Tilson built homes were. It's where Sabathani Community Center is now. It used to be Bryant Junior High. That's this star here. Warrenton School. These schools were all either closed and torn down or closed. Bryant Junior High is still Sabathani Community Center. So the schools were Bryant and Warrenton, Central High School, Horace Mann, and Clinton, which was north of Lake Street. So one question I have is how many of the schools that you attended were torn down? Schools really are a core, I think, to our identity. They do have a lot to do, I think, with how we see our childhood and how we were shaped by the place that we grew up in. So these 4 schools were closed, as I said, and torn down. And I have a neighbor who grew up, went to Central High School, Richard Lockett, who said that that tearing down Central was what changed everything in my community. So it's really a sad thing that these schools were torn down, and it started to be the omen that the Black community could see was not creating equal resources. So from 1950, now we're going to talk about Warrenton School that was torn down. Warrenton, this is the closest school to Field. and Warrenton was on 38th and 3rd Avenue, right across from the Friendship Co-op and next to Bryant. From 1950 to 1960, the Black student population went from 30 to over 80%, reflecting home ownership patterns. The school was overcrowded by 567 pupils in 7 years. There were 4 principals. Due to overcrowding, the boiler room was the break room. And this led to high staff turnover because there were no lunchrooms for staff. It was poor working conditions. And then students were what we call one-way bus. So the difference between pairing and one-way busing is that pairing required that both schools go to each other's school, versus this school at Warrenton, students had to go to Bancroft across Chicago, the race line of Chicago Avenue, to act as if Bancroft was being desegregated. But it was only asking one community to sacrifice. So Warrenton closed in '66. So the Tilson built, the South Side community could see that resources were being not distributed equally. The school district itself reported that the limited playground area served over 1,400 students. Additional acreage is needed because both Bryant and Warrenton had such large student populations. So now we'll go back to the map. I lived here and I went to Hale when I was from kindergarten through 5th grade. And then I was bused to Field. Hale was 99% white and Field was 56% African-American. So in 1971, some of these percentages are not exact, but the school district was at least 90% white. What happened was back in the 30s when Field first opened, people in this area of Shenandoah Terrace, where there were racial covenants, actually went to Field. When it changed hands, I'm actually, if anybody has any information about that, I'd like to know, because now then in the 60s, in my neighborhood or in this area, people went to Hale. I think that it has something to do with how the community was becoming more racially mixed here. So this was considered the Mason-Dixon line. This is the Minnehaha Parkway at the 12th Avenue Bridge, and 70% of the Hale parents opposed school desegregation. So in interviewing the adults that I did that promoted pairing, that were fighting for it, there was only 30% at Hale that wanted it. So there was a huge resistance at Hale. And those who were for it called the Minnehaha Parkway the Mason-Dixon line because there was so much opposition at Hale. So these are Field and Hale schools, and there were a number of lawsuits to keep people to try to prevent this. The school district started to know that it had a problem and created a voluntary area where people could go to each other's schools, but that really wasn't addressing it. So the school board stated for years that the district didn't have a problem. They said that the schools were racially mixed. The school board ignored and denied there were unequal provisions and overcrowding and a lack of staff diversity to avoid white resistance. And then when finally they were forced in the late 60s to come up with a plan to desegregate, they said it's moving too fast. We need to slow down. So now this is a lot of information, but this is how we can see that the schools weren't equal. Field had 46 students per classroom. Hale had 31. Field had 1 teacher lunchroom. Hale had a teacher's lounge and a kitchen. Hale had a library, or Field had a library less than half the size of Hale. Hale had a large library. Field had no kindergarten playroom, and Hale had an extra playroom for kindergartners only. So the Field parents could see Warrenton had closed. Field was being overcrowded. Hale was actually undercrowded. They had to add classrooms at Field. They started adding portables at Field. So the school board, the lawsuit spoke to how there was an identifiably Black school in South Central Minneapolis. Hale and Northrop, the closest schools, were undercrowded. So one of the arguments against school pairing and desegregation was that it would cost too much, that busing is too expensive. But busing happened at Hale. If you live far enough away from Hale, you would be bused to Hale to school, bused home for lunch, bused back to Hale, and bused back home. So 4 times a day you would be bused. So the argument, and there was no busing at Field home for lunch. So the argument that it would be too expensive, that money was already being spent at Hale. There was overcrowding at Field and Washburn, and the district added portables at Washburn. Instead of changing the school boundaries so that Washburn students would go to Central, it just added portables at Washburn. And when I went to Washburn, they added portables. There were portables or classrooms. These are like trailer houses, but they're a classroom. They're just outside of schools, if you don't know what a portable is. The response from Hale parents who were against this was racial violence, sort of Midwestern culture style. Like, opposers weren't hugely publicly vocal like they were in Boston or for the school desegregation with the Little Rock Nine. They acted more behind the scenes to incite fear. So this left is a button that was put on kids by their parents saying, please don't bus me. Violence included car and school fires, bombing and death threats, stalking and harassing school board members and parents who supported desegregation. Harry Davis was the only African-American on the school board who supported it, and he had to have police protection outside his home. In interviewing some of the adults who fought for school desegregation, they talked about how they would be at a grocery store and someone who was in opposition to it would turn and walk away if they saw them, or move at the movie theater, on the bus, or in church. People were called and stalked, saying, we know where you've been. There was a car fire. So these were more behind the scenes. They weren't en masse people protesting against school desegregation. It was more individually targeted at families or individual members. So those from Field and Hale who fought for pairing, largely they were the mothers of the school children and the parents of my friends, and they were the teachers and the school board members who fought for it. So Daniel Bergen from Channel 2 and I have been trying to document through interviews what it was like for them. And this is Mrs. Alberta Johnson and Mrs. Marge Goldberg. And they would host coffee parties at their house or at a church. There were many community member meetings to try to get people to understand the humanity of each other. There was resistance at Field, and in part it was because people were being disrespected. African Americans, many had college degrees at Field. It was where they could finally buy new homes. And one parent said that we should get everyone from Hale and Field and put our degrees on the table and show who's more educated between these two communities. These mothers were like, they would discipline us. If we were on the playgrounds and were being bullies to each other, they would pull our hair. They would kick you off the bus if you weren't being nice to other kids on the bus. So they were in my unit, and I was in the green unit. Mrs. Karen Johnson was our school aide. So it was a wonderful community of mothers whose kids were in the school and then who knew the teachers and the kids. And I was in the green unit. There were 4 units. It was experiential learning at Field. So there was a green unit, a gold unit, a blue, and a red. And each unit had 4 teachers in classrooms and then 1 aide in the classroom. And Mrs. Johnson was an aide, and Mrs. Goldberg was one of the, she was the lead for organizing Field's group to promote pairing. Mr. Mike Andrews was my 5th grade teacher when school pairing started. And he's from Alabama and came here to teach. He was one of the sit-in students in Alabama before he came in. Before he came here, he taught with the Minneapolis schools for 30 years. He recalls what it was like when he started. The first week of school, a group of white teachers came and stood along the side of his classroom questioning his capabilities. And in talking with his wife, they decided finally they should start calling on those parents like they did the kids, and then the parents left. He was with the Minneapolis Public Schools for 30 years, and he's still living in Minneapolis. So the education was very creative. We had shop class, we had culture class. So these are some pictures from what it was like when we were kids at Field. And Mrs. Bessie Griffin, one of the goals of desegregation was to have 10% of all staff on all levels be people of color. So it was, it was really a great experience because, well, we made dashikis in 5th grade. We just learned more about each other than I feel we would not have had we not had school desegregation. And then one of the things I'd like to ask in this PowerPoint is, why is it important that we have teachers that look like our classrooms? It's important, I think, for all kids to have role models that look like them. And I also think it's important for, white kids, because they're going to have bosses that don't look like them someday. And I have children that went through the Minneapolis Public Schools, graduated in 2015, and maybe had one teacher, of African-American teacher. Which is very sad. It's a sad commentary on how far we have not come with desegregation. So we've talked about school pairing and one-way busing. Pairing asked both communities to give something, and one-way busing meant that just at Horace Mann, kids were sent out to Ridgefield. One-way busing really only asked the African-American or the racially mixed school to sacrifice. The last thing, and I'll just cover this briefly, is the concept of disamenities. Maybe you know about this. I just learned about this concept. Disamenities, it really has to do with who gets to live where. Amenities are like their lakes and parks, rivers, Lakeshore Historic District, and disamenities include industrial areas, the freeway like we're talking about today, railroads, anything that creates smog or dust, vibration, and odor. So 35W, when it came through, definitely had an impact. People talk about how it was difficult. The air quality really went down right immediately especially before the barriers came up. So WDGY was a radio station that would have talk shows that was famous for not necessarily being pro desegregation. So I want to say in the end, our lives are shaped by structural racism. Access to goods and services and amenities, public spaces. These policies inform our practices and our daily lives. And this is actually a repeat of what Denise talked about, how this is a wealth accumulation gap. Like I said, I live on the east side of Chicago. Home values are greater there. We can see that we're losing ground, people of color are losing ground with home ownership. I'm not going to repeat those because Denise talked about that. And then this is from CAST, again, a quote. CAST is the infrastructure of our divisions. It's the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. Looking at caste is like holding up a country's X-ray to the light. And these last 4 pictures, this is the end. This was the Cozy Club in North Minneapolis, the Waikiki Room in the Nicollet Hotel. For many of us, we remember when the Fauché was the tallest building in Minneapolis. And the interstate looking out from the Curtis Hotel.